in the shadowed passageways of Topkapi Palace, where the fragrance of jasmine clung to the silk drapes, and the heavy silence of whispered secrets filled the air of the ancient marble. There was a world beyond the reach of ordinary men. It was the land of the haremate, the walled-in heart of the Ottoman Empire that was inside and outside of history, romanticized and misunderstood. But this was not a mere seraglio of idle concubines. Behind these walls resided strong women, intellectual geniuses and destinies whose threads were woven into the very fabric of the empire. Running through it all were the Ottoman princes, laicides, the potential heirs to the throne, born into a world of unparalleled luxury and peril, where every connection could make or break a man's destiny. To see what their lives were like, must step through the gilded gates of the palace and into the velvet-draped world of Ottoman court culture. The architecture of seclusion, the harem, was not only a physical location, but a redoubt of social organization and imperial rule. Situated in the private apartments of the sultanic palaces, most notably in Topkapi Palace, it was a city within a city. The walls were high, the casements guarded with wooden lattice. To outsiders, the harem was a seat of erotic mystery, but to those inside, it was an institution that used love as a device for the hands-on education of the heir to the throne in manners, politics, and manipulation. Here lived the mothers, sisters, and wives of the Ottoman sultans. But most decisively, this is where the princes were brought up, not in the public square of the empire, but in the loving, angry, and at times deceptive arms of the palace women, the sons of the sultan, heirs apparent, cradled in power. And paranoia prince in the Ottoman Empire was born into privilege, but not necessarily into peace. He was cherished and threatened from the day he was born. Ottoman succession was not determined by primogeniture, as in Europe. Instead, there was no heir apparent, and all sons of the sultan had an equal right to inherit the throne. Frequently, this ended in fratricidal rivalries, and there was an unstated truth hanging in the air. Only one prince would live to rule. Princes were brought up with this awareness from their youngest age. Their mothers, who were usually the concubines of diverse ethnicity, Circassian, Georgian, Albanian, Serbian, knew the stakes perhaps more clearly. The survival of their sons often signified their own ascension to the rank of the most powerful female in the empire, valid sultan, the sultan's mother. Thus, the connections between princes and palace women were more than familial. They were strategic partnerships and emotional theaters of war, and sometimes fatal. The mother's ambition, in silk, the woman who mattered most in a prince's life, was invariably his mother. These women, typically referred to as Haseki sultans or later Kadin effendis, were not spouses in the Western understanding of the term, but sex slaves or concubines who were selected from the harem for their beauty, mind, or simply on the basis of the sultan's lust. When they had a son, they were elevated, becoming players in palace life. These mothers were not passive. They operated within the rigid codes of palace hierarchy, built some unlikely alliances, and made their way through feuds with other women, all for the good of their sons. They were often educated in court politics, and were very literate and multilingual. They did more than just oversee their sons. In the nursery, all of them counseled their sons, shaped their education, and even interfered in military and political affairs behind the scenes. Best known among these was Harem Sultan, mother of Selim II, whose letters to her husband Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and foreign dignitaries demonstrated her sharp intellect and political acumen. Sultans Kaksum and Turhan would each later become regents of the empire and de facto rulers during princes' minorities, making it clear that maternal power was no fiction. But for an Ottoman prince, his mother was more than a caregiver. She was often his first political advisor, his protector, and in certain cases, his sole true ally. El Pisrea, Los Únicos Protectors de Carne, y Destino. Both the princes and the harem women were guided by the black eunuchs, castrated the men who were the harem's security and administration guards. The Kisla Akosk, or chief black eunuch, was one of the most influential occupants of such a post, and the only other servant who could speak to the sultan. And early 20th century travelers reported that some noble mothers put their forward sons into such service. He had control of the entrances to and from the inner and outer palace, and regulated life in the harem. Eunuchs were teachers and disciplinarians, and sometimes spies, to the young princes. They brought orders directly from the sultan. They warned mothers of dangers and opportunities. and they influenced the education and the minds of their princely charges. Their allegiance was indissolubly linked to the palace. Some had legitimate emotional connections to the princes or their mothers. Others were simply pawns in the larger game of succession politics. Sisters and servants. Power dynamics in New Testament communal relationships. A prince may have relatively remote position in imperial politics, yet his sisters had a curious position. In palace life, Ottoman princesses were used to marry sons of rank by morganatic relationships, and this cemented the bond between the military and bureaucracy to the dynasty. These princesses also became channels of influence, passing on messages or favors between their princely brothers and the outer court. Harem women, serving women of high rank, who in many cases have been educated and trained for years, might also win favor and rise to authority. A sly and discreet servant could also be a prince's confidant, whispering in his ear or protecting him from his enemies. So the harem wasn't just a privatish domestic palace, it was a site of information, ambition, and canny manipulation. Princes who steered wisely in this world developed in many cases into able statesmen. Those who did not succeed, though, were consigned to obscurity or worse. Forbidden loves and silent affairs, even with the rules in place. Romance wasn't far from the harem. Donna immobile, young princes, amid a group of beautiful and brilliant women, were sometimes caught in forbidden love, squandering their affection where it was banned. Such connections could easily result in scandal, or worse. These secret liaisons could be weapons for enemies. A prince who was too doting on a concubine might be accused of being a softie, or worse, of being in some sort of conspiracy with her foreign relatives. Some rumors claimed that the women in the harem were spies for European powers, a prospect that the Ottoman court did not take lightly. Still, love blossomed. Whether chaste affection or politically inspired lust, these relationships molded the personalities and the decisions of numerous future sultans. A prince's education, handed to a woman to raise, and not just to read from. Princes were kept in the women's quarters until the age of 12 and received their education from their mothers or the women of the family and performed women's work. Their childhood was spent studying the Quran, court etiquette, poetry, music, and conversational skills. They were subsequently placed in the charge of male tutors and then sent off to govern provinces as part of the Sankak system, a proving ground for their administrative mettle. But the early textbooks on power and loyalty, manipulation and fear, all had their start in the harem. Everyone he looked at or didn't look at, everyone who spoke to him or remained silent, every alliance he had formed or might form with a wet nurse, a maid, a eunuch, all of these contributed to the prince's understanding of the empire. That was to one day be his to rule. Conclusion: a queendom behind the Tiarchoroni. The affairs of Ottoman princes and the women of the palace were complex weaves of loyalties, ambitions, affections, and power. Far from being separated from power, these women created it through their sons, through their whispering behind silk screens, through invisible hands pulling history's strings. In our ongoing series, as we venture further down this path, we will look at some of those stories and of the men and women who stood behind those men. We'll discover stories of betrayal, sacrifice, forbidden desire, and political genius. For in the Ottoman court, power did not always wear a turban or bear a sword. Sometimes it donned a veil and spoke through a latticework. The structure of power, the harem. Explained: harem as a word comes from the Arabic harem, meaning forbidden or sacred, and it is literal and metaphorical in the story. The harem itself, on the physical level, was a well-protected part of the palace that was only entered by royal family members and a few. Spiritually, it was a holy place, an inner sanctum where the heart of the dynasty thudded, softly but with tremendous force. Cockburn notes that despite Orientalist conjurings of the harem as a realm of idle luxury and infinite delights, it was rather more complicated than that. It was an institution with an inflexible hierarchy, regulations, punishment, and connections. The female members of the harem, mothers, wives, concubines, slaves, were not only passive. Most of these women were learned and cultural and political insiders in the ruling house, especially during the period known as the Sultanate of Women. In the 16th and 17th centuries, this was the world in which Ottoman princes grew up. From the time they could first see, the first people they had contact with were women, primarily their mothers, but also wet nurses, nursemaids, and the female attendants who surrounded the palace. Part 1. The boys in the harem, the early period. Princes, as sons of the Hro. Every Ottoman prince was born into a world in which his father was other than human. He was the Sultan's shadow of the god on earth, defender of Islam, and lord of a vast empire. Yet the princes had not had much of a relationship with their fathers when they were young. Instead, their closest connections were with the women of the harem. The prince's first years were spent either in the apartment of the valid sultan or in the harem's nursery section. Their day nurses, saikarai, and natural mothers were the most influential in their upbringing. Indeed, a prince would sometimes live or die by the influence of his mother in the harem. For centuries, the Ottoman dynasty had practiced polygamy with concubinage, not dynastic marriage. This made for princes who were not born to queens, but two concubines, frequently Christian or Circassian women imprisoned in the harem and trained to be the servants of the dynasty. The position of a concubine was dramatically altered upon her giving birth to a son. From there, she was no longer a concubine, but rather Hoseki, Sultan, the Sultan's favorite, or later the valid Sultan, mother of the reigning Sultan, and would wield huge political power. For the young prince, it meant that his own status within the palace hierarchy was closely tied to his mother's maneuvers in the world of court politics. The closer she got to the Sultan, the more chance her son had of a future of power, or even simple life. Bastards in the pulpit politics of motherhood, rivalries and loyalties. The harem was never one big, sisterly whole. It was a balance of power, envy, and ambition, fine as a hair. When a prince came into the world, his mother was at once sucked into the palace's unspoken competition, a slightly shadowy, but omnipresent contest for the throne. As the Ottoman succession was from the beginning anchored in seniority rather than rotten in the Kingdom of Jerusalem from quintessentially Western Europe, every prince was a possible successor. Accordingly, the mothers of these princes were heavily involved in the destiny of their sons. This maternal politics had a huge impact on the everyday experiences of princes. Their mothers were generally responsible for the education of their sons, the choice of tutors, and they also made alliances or rivalries with other influential women of the harem. Thus, an Ottoman prince was not initiated into the twists and turns of life at court through a general impression the world out there. Instead, even his contact with the world of adults turned around the presence of women within the harem. One of the most well-known cases of such a pattern is found in the life of Mahidevran Sultan, Prince Mustafa's mother, whose rivalry with Harem Sultan, the mother of future Sultan Selim II, became legendary. Their conflict was personal, to be sure, but it also represented an embodiment of the larger political stakes. Each was making moves to make sure her son succeeded to the throne. The eunuch keepers in the gendered space of the harem in this world of women. One of the very few men princes met were the black eunuchs Kisler Akosk, custodians of the harem. These were emasculated men, generally of African descent, who acted as go-betweens between the male and female quarters of the court. They were very powerful, the gatekeepers to the women's quarters, and served as the intermediaries between the princes and their mothers and other influential women. From childhood, Ottoman princes were conditioned to show respect, and sometimes also a healthy fear, for these guards. He was not only a guardian of the harem, but also one of the participants in palace politics, as he frequently supported the valid sultan in both conflicts of succession and matters of state, education and gender expectations. Ottoman princes were educated in accordance with a strenuous program from a very early age. This was not only an education in subjects like the Quran, Arabic, Persian, mathematics, and history, but in manners and graces, swordsmanship, and the art of government. But interestingly, the vast majority of their early socialization, and more importantly, their sense of emotional intelligence, was formed by the women of their lives. They were schooled in how to comport themselves with grace, what to say and not to say, and the labyrinthine protocol of palace life lessons, frequently learned by osmosis through the observation and interaction with the women of the harem. The early upbringing imbued many princes with a kind of dual culture. They were raised, on the one hand, to be warriors and rulers, but on the other, to be softer in a diplomatic sense, understanding people, negotiating, using charm as a tool of rule. It was a construction that combined masculinity and femininity, one that frequently distinguished Ottoman royalty from their Western peers. The close ties of princes to their mothers. Most of these Ottoman princes found their mothers to be not only guardians and teachers, but also emotional mooring. It was a profound legacy that carried over into adulthood and affected both important political choices and private predilections. The prestige of the valid sultan in the Ottoman Empire, an effective chief regent when her son was sultan, turned the mother-son relationship into an institution, not just a personal relationship. The sultan was an empire's ruler, but in many cases the mother advised from the shadows, via the filter of a lifetime of mutual experience and trust. Such closeness could be used against them by members of other court factions, but it assured them a certain constancy. A good son who trusted his oriental and Teganetlianger mother could not so easily be tricked or seduced by court intrigue or his viziers. Conclusion. The women's invisible empire women are all but absent from the court records of the Ottoman Empire, but in the experience of the princes, the future sultans who would direct the course of millions of lives, these women were everywhere and inescapable. They were the silent shapers of imperial destiny. With this first chapter of our story, the door has been flung open to this mysterious realm. As we continue, we will examine how the relationship between princes and the women of the palace developed, deepened, and at times exploded under the pressures of power, love, ambition, and betrayal. In the next chapter, we'll uncover more details about what kind of impact the harem's most critical position, that of the valid sultan, would have on the men who ruled the world's longest-lasting Islamic empire. When we consider the Ottoman Empire, we tend to imagine splendid viziers, conquering sultans and far-flung military campaigns. Yet hidden in the shrouded hallways of Topkapi Palace were women whose power could match that of the empire's most famous men. They were the valid sultans, the mothers of Ottoman sultans, and their power reached well beyond the confines of the harem. They were political advisors, shadow rulers, mentors, and, most importantly, a first and foremost formative relation in the life of any Ottoman prince. In this chapter we examine the intricate and profound part played by the valid sultan on the lives of their sons, and on the functioning of the Ottoman state itself. From imperial consort to empress, the progression of a valid sultan's journey usually started under a different name, a concubine, usually not of Turkish descent, Kashin, Georgian, Greek, Serbian, Ukrainian. The women, who were acquired through tribute, conquest, or markets, all went through years of training in the harem school. There, they received training in court protocols, language, religion, music, poetry, and the practice of palace diplomacy. It was a situation where only a handful of concubines could gain the sultan's favor. Even fewer could beget him children, and among them, only one woman, the mother of her son who became sultan, would ever attain the top position of valid sultan. To be valid sultan wasn't only personal victory, it was political rise. The office held all of the political power, wealth, and influence of the empire, and also the right to command the attendance of key officials, including the harem and even the Kisla Akosk, who could only approach the sultan with the consent of the Grand Vizier. The valid sultan even had a seal, palace staff, and court of her own. But most of all, she was what her son's life revolved around. The Holy Pact, mother and prince valid, sultan versus reigning sultan. The relationship that a valid sultan had with little boys, her son who was always the sultan, was usually the only real replica of love in the court of the Ottoman, while marriage alliances created the possibility for there to be a queen descended from some powerful noble family with its own weighty interest in who should take the throne. Ottoman rule depended solely on the authority and support of men's mothers, whose authority was solely dependent on their sons. The valid sultan would attend the sultan's accessions to the throne, where she would advise him. She had brought him up, followed his education, had provided for his guidance, had sheltered him from the dangers which surrounded a young prince at the time of succession, and she it was who could least be suspected of his disaffection. This loyalty made her indispensable. In a society where mothers were often highly educated in politics and the arts, sultans, such as Suleiman the Magnificent, would often rely upon motherly advice on how to handle matters of diplomacy, religion, and even war. Some were emotionally dependent on their mothers, others more buttoned up, but almost all respected and feared their judgment. This maternal grip also reached in every area of the prince's life, from his education and relationships to his political appointments and foreign policy. The valid sultan held a sizable domain of power and could be the one to make or break the fortunes of viziers, to arrange or prevent marriages, and also from who was allowed to enter her sons' Private chambers, the Sultanate of Women. The women of the House of Osman from the 16th to the early 17th century was a period when the influence of the Kadınlar Sultanati Sultanate of Women increased. Valid sultans and expiring possessions were active in the decision-making apparatus and had developed visible influence in the state of the valid sultans. Kaksim Sultan may have been the most prominent. She was regent of her son Murad IV. She was not only a political strategist, but a power broker who ran the empire from the shadows, ordering executions, influencing appointments, and controlling the imperial treasury. Likewise, Harem Sultan Selim II's mother introduced new roles for the sultan's mother. Harem, originally a slave from Ruthenia, what is modern-day Ukraine, did manage to change herself into a political player. She corresponded with foreign rulers, founded charitable institutions, and even inserted herself in palace intrigue to secure her son's ascendancy. This was not an anomalous state of affairs. However, it was part of a larger trend in Ottoman politics whereby women mothers especially began to play a crucial role in the functioning of the state. Kingmakers as mothers. Role and succession. The most significant power of the valid sultan was to have control over the succession. In the Ottoman Empire, it was not the eldest son who inherited the throne, but rather the one who regained the capital and survived the others. That made all princes potential successors, and the one who won the post-sultan battle of succession was guaranteed the throne. This system made succession brutal. Fratricide, that is, the killing of brothers, was even institutionalized for centuries in some political structures precisely to avoid civil war, and in this cutthroat competition, a mother's political networks, alliances, and power often determined whether her son sacrificed his life. Valid sultans prepared their sons for succession in subtle, yet formidable manners, orchestrating alliances with influential viziers, manipulating palace gossip, brokering with the janissaries, and framing the narrative of legitimacy. Some went so far as to take dramatic steps, such as sending messengers to provincial governors or bribing military factions to back their sons. Behind every successful prince was generally a mother, who had fought as hard as any general. The emotional price of power, yet this role came at a cost. The road to becoming valid sultan was frequently strewn with heartbreak. Victims' families were no strangers to having lost other sons to the practice of fratricide. Others had been guilt-ridden at political moves that had caused death or exile for rival princes. Some valid sultans were gentle, others iron. Almost all, though, had felt the emotional weight of watching their children enter into bloody power struggles. The system that made them strong was one that implicated them in its violence. Valid sultans in rare instances saw their sons go from grace to be ousted. Kaksim Sultan, the previous most powerful woman in the empire, was strangled in her chambers by her also powerful daughter, Lord Turhan Sultan. So, the palace could raise a mother to the ultimate heights of power and cast her down just as quickly. The valid sultan, as guardian of the empire outside of their political and familial roles. Valid sultans left their own mark on the Ottoman social and cultural arena. They used their enormous wealth and power to finance buildings, endowed charities, and found religious establishments. Their endowments, or in Ottoman Turkish vakıfs, went to schools, mosques, hospitals, soup kitchens, and places for travelers to rest. These works would not only bring glory to the royal family, and thus to the reigning sultans, but were also a means of public charity and spiritual salvation for the valid sultans. The sultan's mother's, Istanbul's, valid sultan mosque, was originally constructed by Sofi and later restored under Turk, and stands as an eloquent witness to the architectural and cultural legacy of these formidable women. In the process, they solidified their sons' legitimacy, not only by military or political might, but by religious and civic worship. Valid sultan and the princes, a love well spoiled. The bond between a valid sultan and the son who became sultan could be tender, complex, and or volatile. She was part mother and part advisor, protector and strategist, nurturer and occasionally political manipulator. Some sons loved and respected their mothers, others felt they were outshone or repressed by their mother's power. In some instances, this tension grew into estrangement or even palace conspiracies, but even among the most distant relationships, the specter of the mother's presence was large. The valid sultan played a key role in shaping the world view of a prince. Through her, he learned diplomacy, patience, and strategy, and, last but not least, the ruthless imperatives of power. The series is named for the second of his wives. She was also the first, and perhaps the most enduring female presence in his life, and she helped mold the monarch he would become. Conclusion: empire, motherhood, and legacy. In the narrative of the Ottoman Empire, the valid Sultan looms large as a figure, absent as much as present. She created princes, made politics, and ensured dynastic continuity. Her epitaph is not recorded in victories and conquests, but in the survival and thriving of the sons that she produced. The story of the valid Sultan is the story of how motherhood turned into the mother of all political institutions, and how, behind palace walls, the mother of a prince turned into the mother of an empire. In our next chapter, we will also study the growing language skills of the tutors, concubines, and young palace women with whom Ottoman princes spent their early lives, and of how these relationships either enabled or impeded the road to power for young men on the move. Before the prince was a ruler, a warrior, a political operator, he was a little boy, usually a lonely one, who grew up behind high walls, in a world ordered by protocol, hierarchy, and secrets, while his mother, the valid, wielded complete power over his life. A diverse galaxy of females comprised the young prince's daily emotional world: governesses, wet nurses, tutors' wives, concubines, interreigning, and adolescent harem girls. Throughout the annals of history, however, these women who never made it past the kids' table had a profound impact on the Ottoman princes who adored them. In this chapter, we illuminate the emotional infrastructure of the Imperial Palace, the intimate and personal relations that turned caterpillar-like young boys into future sultans, the hidden women, the invisibility of the governess and wet nurse. From his first hours, an Ottoman prince was reared by days wet nurses, who were his second mothers, selected for their loyalty, physical health, and moral rectitude. These women would breastfeed the prince, care for him in his early years, and, in many cases, continue in his household for decades. It was a close and intimate tie between a prince and his wet nurse. She was called Saint Anne Milkmother, and was accorded several rights, financial security, and generally ceremonial debt of honor. Her children were known as milk brothers and sisters, Saint Cardisi, and these natal relations were still remembered generations after the prince had reached adulthood. Some princes, when they became ruler, bestowed on their milk brothers land, or made them high officers, an indication of the lasting force of these first connections. Princes were also looked after by a governess, an older, educated lady, who oversaw the day-to-day running of their lives. These women were responsible for discipline, manners, and providing emotional guidance. In a highly regimented and hierarchical palace setting, governesses provided a welcome source of consistency, patience, and affection. Education, tutors and their families. While eventually male tutors would come of age to be responsible for a prince's education in religion, battlefield tactics, and ruling palace politics. The early years within the harem were directed by women. The male tutors of his teachers did too, including two begins after he became king. Queen Wolkan was accompanied by young married men and supported by two young marrieds and female relative of the queen's men. Mementos of child damage. Top 0. These women, in many cases, actually taught informal education how to read, how to act properly, even how to tell stories. They told stories drawn from Persian literature, Turkish epics, or Quranic parables, planting in the prince early lessons about morality, gender roles, power. Tales of formidable females such as the Queen of Sheba, Roxolana, or Harem Sultan weren't just good stories. They set the stage for how a prince would later view influence through the mediating influence of women. Tutors, wives, unlike harem concubines, were free of courtly ambitions. This created a space of confidence and effective sincerity in their relationships with princes during periods of stress or when punished for bad behavior. Concubine, mistress, prospects, the silent onlookers and fodder for curiosity. As a prince passed into adolescence, so did his scrutiny of the opposite sex, and he had a world of gorgeous, smart, and generally secretive women, concubines, in training all around him inside the harem. These women, who were usually 12 to 20 years old, were not just decorative. They learned charm, music, poetry, fashion, and Islamic morality. They were taught to work in the palace, but to be married off to potential royalty, even the princes themselves. While interactions were strictly regulated, the meeting of the Princes and concubines did occur perhaps during ceremonies or processions, or whispers behind veils. For the teenage prince, those encounters were usually charged with confusion, attraction and desire. Other concubines were specifically given to the princes by the time they became sexually active, at around 14 or 15, as a means of controlling and channeling their desires. These meticulously placed unions were less love-based than palace-based. The concubine who bore the prince's child would rise in status, and her family, if it was known, might also benefit. But for a number of princes, this would be their first emotional connection, and, in some cases, even their first love, with a concubine. These early relationships, whether in return or not, have informed how they view intimacy, power and gender roles, unrequited love, jealousy, and an emotionally uncommunicative prince. Not all interactions between princes and palace women were predetermined or successful. There were anecdotes too plethoric and too poorly documented of young princes taking up with women they couldn't have. That might be a pretty singer in the harem choir, or a concubine given to another prince, or a governess who had favored him. These attachments were often a source of jealousy, heartbreak, or bitterness. The interior of the palace was not an empty space. It was a realm of competition and envy and unspoken desire. For a prince under constant surveillance, these desires must have been suppressed, subdued, or expressed through poetry, an art in which many Ottoman princes were proficient. Some princes left behind divans collections of poems brimming with verses that expressed silent love, anguish, or unrequited longing. Their muses, unmentioned but for a single photograph, had often been palace women, the sources of those profound emotional stirrings experienced during their impressionistic young years. These experiences also served as the prince's training in the effective intrigues of court life, how to suppress desire, how to manage affection, how to deploy charm as a political tool. The harem was more than a school of love. It was also a forge of emotional fortitude, discipline, shame, and controlling masculinity. Discipline came with education and with emotional growth. The harem was a center of serious etiquette, while a prince who overreached his authority, sneaking into forbidden quarters, showing favoritism toward a certain woman, breaking protocol in some minor way, was harshly punished, sometimes publicly humiliated. Often, older harem women acted as the disciplinarian. They reported to the valide, sultan, or even into the sultan. These women, as well as teaching the prince decorum, reinforced the point that female eyes were always watching. Such omnipresent surveillance gave rise to four contrasted mental attitudes in a great many princes. The exterior composed one side by the side, with an internal one very wide awake. They were used to acting out a part while trying to do their own thing on the side. In that regard, their emotional constitution was forged not just in love and nurture, but also in secrecy, performance and control. The adolescent girl, playmate, rival and confidant. What is easily forgotten is how many of the women in the harem were children or teenagers. 2. Some of these girls, particularly those near the age of the princes, formed innocent friendships such as playing games, reciting verses, or singing together. These girls would eventually end up competing against each other, especially if they were vying to be potential concubines. For the prince, his earliest playmates had become mixed up with childhood happiness, first attractions, and finally adult politics. In some instances, a playmate in his early years would eventually serve as a concubine or bear his first child. Those connections based on mutual innocence could form lifelong friendships, or tragedy. As the palace's politics could change, the foundations of courtly masculinity, this web of feminine influence profoundly shaped the emotional, psychological, and sexual development of the young Ottoman prince. He was brought up in a paradox, in the presence of women, yet raised to rule over them. Emotionally close, politically distant, inspired by intimacy, educated in detaching. From governesses to milk mothers, from concubines to boyhood companions, the women of the harem had instructed the prince, not only to feel, but to conceal what he felt. They were readying him for a world in which power would demand silence. Love would be strategic, and loyalty would always carry a price. Conclusion: an emotions blueprint. By the prince, when an Ottoman prince exited the harem to become a provincial governor or jockey for the throne, he had, in any case, been heavily molded by the women of his youth. He learned from those relationships what power meant, the meaning of love, how to manipulate, the meaning of loyalty. No official record of any of these women exists. Their names have been lost to dusty records, but the legacy is eternal, imprinted on the soul of any Ottoman prince who ever dreamt, lusted, or ruled. We continue to stalk the Ottoman princes into the world outside the harem and beyond palace walls in the following chapter. Their first foray into the province as a taste of freedom, of power, of sex with adult women. Inside the harem, a realm where a handful of women dictated the fate of an empire, a single, unlikely girl would be queen, and a young prince would become king. The Ottoman dynasty, for all its power, stood shakily on the rickety ladder of human connections forged not only in council chambers or on fields of war, but in glance across a garden, in poetry exchanged by candlelight, or in the soft rustle behind a curtain deep in the night. This chapter treats the most sensitive and most crucial personal relationship in Ottoman history, that of the prince and the concubine. It was in these trysts of desire, scheming, fear and hope that seeds of future rule, and sometimes ruin, were sown. Concubinage, more than just a lover, the word concubine can, to the outsider, conjure a picture of demure women, objects of male pleasure. But inside the Ottoman harem, concubinage was an institution, highly organized, meticulously tended, and deeply entwined with imperial politics. Concubines were not slaves in the traditional sense, and were in theory protected by law. In which ways they were not, one can easily think of as well. They were educated, trained and prepared for years before they attracted the attention of a prince or sultan. Those who advanced were smart, cool, politically astute. Some, in time, would be the mothers of future sultans, and informally the rulers of the empire. To sleep in a prince's bed was not just an act of intimacy, it was a calculated positioning at the heart of imperial fate. And to bear his child was to ascend the bloodied staircase that led to power, recruitment and training. A palace in a palace, the concubines were chosen with the greatest circumspection. Many were Christian, Georgian, Circassian, Serbian, Venetian, captured in war, given in tribute, purchased in furtive transactions from the borders of Europe and Asia. Once in the harem, identities were ripped from them and they were given new names, often Persian or Arabic ones, and instructed in Turkish, Islam, palace etiquette, and the arts of music, dance, embroidery, and conversation. Their lives were rigid, ordered, jammed into infinite hierarchies, but few would be chosen for the private chambers of a prince. This was not a decision made on aesthetics alone. Intelligence, personality, values, talent, and discretion were equally essential. A concubine who could capture a prince's attention, calm his frustrations, stimulate his ambitions, safeguard his secrets. Such a woman could alter the fate of empires. The first contact, ritual, and seduction. It was never by chance that a prince and a concubine first meet. Behind every seemingly casual exchange or glance lay a spiderweb of calculation by the prince, his mother, the eunuchs, the woman. Scenes did not lack for imagination, but sometimes an concubine or two might even be gifted to a prince by the chief eunuch or his mother as a political maneuver. In other cases, a prince would spot a woman in the garden or during a performance and then request her presence quietly. But officially, the meeting itself was heavy with ritual. Perfumes were selected with care, frequently rose, musk, or amber. Clothes were chosen for stylish effect and significance. The concubine was supposed to amuse, fascinate, and submit, at the same time keeping an eye out for signals of favor or of peril. For the prince, this was more than a romantic gesture. It was a profoundly political one. His selection of a partner could spark jealous rivalries in the harem, alienate allies, or communicate alliances. It may have even influenced the way his father, the reigning sultan, perceived his maturity or loyalty. But in between these stratagem layers, genuine emotion could sometimes blossom. Love, at a time of suspicion, a dangerous game. Though a life of codes in the palace, love was not dead. There are tales, some historical, others whispered, of princes who fell deeply for their concubines, crossing lines of expectations and tradition. Some forsook other women entirely, as monogamy was an atypical, risky path. Others tried to promote their favorites by conferring on them the status, rights, and privileges of higher-ranked consorts, or by unofficially marrying them. But love was dangerous at the Ottoman court. If a concubine held too much power, she might be regarded as a threat, not only by other harem women, but by viziers, generals, and the sultan himself. She could be charged with spying, witchcraft, or seducing him. All that to say, love could be the siren's call, making a prince lose his political clarity. For a concubine, to fall in love was to bet everything, for if the prince fell from favor, so did she, and if he never ascended to sultan, her life could descend into chaos. The valid sultan, changing images of motherhood and royal identity by Murat Huliathi. Final step in a concubine's journey to full-fledged status was not just love, but the arrival of a baby. If a concubine had a son, her life was transformed. She would become a Khadin, and if her son became sultan, she would ascend to the most powerful female role in the empire. Valid sultan, the queen mother. The prince was instrumental in this metamorphosis. The favor of God, his arm and his station, saved mother and son. The emotional attachment between some of them would grow stronger after giving birth, in which case the favored concubine would often share the status as wife with her master. But the arrival of a son also proved a danger. The concubine quickly became a focus of jealousy and political intrigue. Her opponents could try to kill her off by poison, scandal, or tricks. There was a lot on the line because in the Ottoman system, only one son could rise. The others could be exiled, imprisoned, or even executed, it explains. The birth of a prince to a concubine was not just a birthright, was the opening of a game to the death. Notable examples: the empires that shaped their love stories. Women who, as concubines, became the loves of princes ultimately shaped Ottoman history. Alexandra Lassan, harem sultan who was enslaved in Ruthenia at an age of 15 and then trained for the palace where she was the favorite concubine of Prince Suleiman, who became Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Their relationship was radical. He married her in law, a departure from centuries of tradition. Her impact affected international diplomatic relations, charitable foundations, and even the line of succession. Mahpeka Kasem Sultan, born Anastasia, was a Greek from the island of Tinos, who served Ahmed I in his harem. She would become the mother of several of his children, and 2 of his sons would later become sultans. She therefore managed Turkish affairs during the reigns of her sons and grandsons, showing to what extent a former concubine would have higher political authority. These women were not anomalies. They were the face of a system that, while overtly patriarchal, depended deeply on the intelligence and sway of women behind closed doors, jealousies, shadows, and the sword of destiny. But for every harem or kasem, there were dozens of concubines whose fates passed in silence or sorrow. Several were simply spent and discarded, or caught up in the crossfire of succession battles. Some went on to bear sons who were in turn killed by their brothers. Some were exiled to distant palaces and not allowed to see the men they had once loved. The favored concubine, too, lived with a sword dangling over her head. One misspoken word, one misjudged alliance, one change in palace power meant disgrace or death. And still, through it all, the relationship between prince and concubine was one of the most significant and transformative in the Ottoman Empire. Conclusion: an empire-building relationship. The tale of a prince and a concubine was never merely a private love story. It was a slanting dialectic between love and politics, affection and ambition, closeness and control. In the right hands, a prince could be trained to become a wise ruler, or a pawn. A concubine taken to a prince's breast could ascend to the highest political levels, or sink into dangerous complacency in the harem. It was the battleground where dynasties were made and unmade. The following chapter, however, will take us deeper into the lives of the Ottoman princes themselves, more than lovers or sons, but as young rulers struggling their way through the treacherous channels of succession, power, and betrayal. Succession wasn't a birthright among the sprawling confines of the Ottoman Empire. It was a battlefield. The blood of Osman flowed in the veins of every son, but only one could hold authority. And unlike the clear lines of primogeniture that guided European monarchies, the Ottoman dynasty was ruled by a brutal, ancient logic: survival of the fittest. Not the oldest, not the wisest, not the favorite. The throne was not passed down like a family heirloom. It was taken by force, and it opens a window on the lethal sibling rivalries that plagued the royal family for generations. These were not trivial fights about inheritance or titles. They were battles to the death, with a certain death waiting for the loser. In the land of crescents and minarets, brotherhood too often gave way to betrayal, and the crown had been hammered out in the crucible of treachery. Dynasty without primogeniture, conflict and inheritance in the early medieval West. The Ottomans didn't have the European custom in which the old king is succeeded by the old king's eldest son. The empire, from its beginning, functioned on the idea that the most suitable son, that is, the one who showed he had the power to be sultan, should inherit rule. This ideal made sense in a warrior empire. The young Ottoman state was founded in war, built through conquest, and led by men of extraordinary power and magnetism. To leave it up to fate, or age, may mean weakness at the top. But with the ever-expanding empire, this was a recipe for chaos. Each sultan had several sons, all by different concubines, with their own court factions, and brought up in separate provinces as part of the sancak system. These young kings were educated to become rulers, administrators, and generals. They weren't just being trained to fight, they were being tested for dominance. Inevitably, as soon as the sultan fell, or even grew ill, there would be a silent war among the brothers. The equestrian fields of Sankaklara as early as the 15th century, Ottoman princes began to be sent to govern provinces as governors known as Sankakbai or Sankakbai governor. By the time they came of age, Manisa, Amasha, Konya-Trabzon, Kutaya are some of the cities where the sons of the sultans were trained for ruling the empire. Each prince had brought his own court miniaturized, tutors, advisors, guards, and a retinue of loyal servants. Even though they were theoretically at these courts to learn how to govern, every move a prince took was being observed. How he dispensed justice, suppressed rebellion, collected taxes, and handled local governors all showed that he was both competent and ambitious. But it was also here that brotherly competition became its most malevolent. Messages were intercepted, spies slotted in, alliances made. The contest was not in principle, it was real, and it was personal. At other times, the brothers communicated in verse or through coded letters, hiding warnings and threats in lines of Persian love poetry. And they were young men, clever and ambitious, court-bred and court-sharpened, playing a deadly game that they had been prepared for since birth. The moment of death when the battles began for Rialtha, the death of a victorious sultan, didn't signal a peaceful transfer of power. It was the start of a race to the death among brothers. Messengers galloped across the empire before the funeral had taken place to summon the princes. But speed was everything. The first of the prince to get the capital and gain the bath, the viziers and the key men in the court, would generally seize the sultanate. But his work was not complete until his antagonists had been hobbled. In early times this could mean only one thing. Fratricide. Vesek v. Unser included Sultan Mehmed II. Cognitus ut. Memidas lex fratricidi canunam eliasmanquedam iuris. Auctoritas edibat novo imperatori fratres suas occidende. Cosa ut status cohera possit. It was a savage, cold-blooded doctrine, and for centuries it essentially became the standard practice. Execution rituals. Blood on silkwen, a prince won the throne. His other brothers were typically cajoled back to the capital, with guarantees of safety, reconciliation, or rule. They rarely survived the visit. The executions, which were conducted using a silken cord, were intended to prevent the mixed ancestry of the royal line from being tainted by having their blood spill on the earth. Mute or deaf executioners trained in silent killing were employed. It was rapid and covert, and the bodies were buried with no ceremony. In other cases, having become sultan, he convinced himself that he wanted to save the condemned men and women, and stayed the executions, with rebellions or civil war as the result. In some cases, the forced deaths took place within hours after ascension, taking away young even princes. It was fratricide, not vengeful and personal, but a cold policy of state. Case history. Bayezid II and Sem Sultan, perhaps the most famous. Ottoman brotherly rivalry took place in the late 15th century between Bayezid II and his brother, Sem Sultan. Their father Mehmed the Conqueror died. Bayezid was living in Istanbul while Sem was in central Anatolia. Both declared themselves sultan. Sem gathered an army and set out to meet his brother, but he was defeated and he ran away. First to Mamluk Egypt, then to Rhodes, where he was imprisoned by the Knights Hospitaller and handed over to the Pope. Bayezid had paid out half of his yearly revenues to his brother in Europe, hoping to keep him there as a maimed-up invalid. Sem became a pawn of the Christian powers to be played in the hands of the Ottomans. For almost a decade, Sem never did overthrow his brother, but his exile haunted the reign of Bayezid. It was a chilling reminder that a surviving brother was a threat for life. Case: Selim I and Prince Ahmed Sultan Selim I, nicknamed Javuz the Grim, had fought a deadly battle against his brother, Ahmed, to achieve the throne. Ahmed was also more of a governor and had a stronger claim in the opinion of many statesmen, but Selim, a skilled military leader, outwitted him by gaining the allegiance of crucial elements of the Janissaries. Civil war broke out, and Selim's army emerged as the victor over Ahmed's forces. Ahmed was executed, and Selim had his nephews murdered, wiping out all threats. His efficient brutality set the stage one of the most expansionist reigns in Ottoman history, in which the empire incorporated the Mamluk Sultanate and seized the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Selim's tale was anything but unique. It was a template, a shift in policy, from fratricide to incarceration by the 17th century. Fratricide horrors came under condemnation from the court and Islamic theologians. Public sentiment shifted. This practice became more and more disturbing, especially as it related to very young princes, none of whom were likely to ever cause any problems. A new system evolved. Kafes, literally the cage. Sultans began to place their brothers under house arrest rather than executing them, and confine them in luxurious but isolated apartments in the palace. Such princes were excluded from political careers, marriage, or having children. They were placed under lifelong, decades-long, or even less protracted surveillance, until their natural deaths, or if the backup heirs were needed, rushing onto the stage. Although the practice brought the blood-drenched era to a close, it spawned its own tragedy. Some of the princes raised in the kafes became insane. They were unproven, pulled away, and psychologically unsound. And when these men were raised to power like Ibrahim I, who was mentally ill, they brought disorder, paranoia, and arbitrary rule. It was one of sanity versus blood, and neither one piece. The mother's role in sibling rivalry. Behind each prince stood his mother. Brothers competed against one another, often to satisfy their mother's ambitions. Mothers lobbied ferociously for their sons, bribing officials, making coalitions, copting eunuchs, even murmuring in the sultan's ear. These women risked exile or execution if their sons were to lose. The stakes were maternal survival. Some mothers, like Kaksum Sultan, endured successive reigns by masterfully changing her alliances, supporting one son's death so that another could ascend to the throne. For example, a few were executed along with their sons. Their names were wiped from the palace records. It wasn't just a war of brothers, it was a war of mothers. Conclusion: a fratricidal dynasty built upon brotherhood. To be an Ottoman prince born at all was to be one part lucky and one part damned. Your every move was scrutinized, your friendships assessed, your failures counted. You weren't taught to accept peace. You were raised to wield power, and having got hold of it, you had to fasten it with blood. This brutal cycle of sibling rivalry is what sustained the empire for hundreds of years. It had given birth to some of history's greatest rulers, but also had left behind a wake of muted voices, unopened letters, and silenced dreams. In this chapter, we move from the battlefield to another domain of power, the chambers of the valide sultan, queens who ruled their own empires from behind the veil as the mothers of princes. In the Ottoman Empire, a place of silent, incredible power was born behind golden lattice and rose-scented halls of the Imperial harem. She was no queen, for the Ottoman state had no official queen. She never appeared at state ceremonies, rode into battle, or signed decrees in public, but her hand could raise a vizier, unmake a grand admiral, or even decide the succession of the next sultan. She was valide sultan, the mother of the sultan, and a ruler of an empire within an empire. In this pushback epic, we follow the extraordinary women who were part of a race to influence Ottoman politics, navigate palace intrigue, and exert unmatched power in a world that was never meant to hear them speak. The birth of a role, not just a title. Valide sultan means mother sultan. It may sound ceremonial, but in reality, it represented the highest echelon a woman could reach in the Ottoman court. Influential, but unofficial, was the sultan's mother before the 16th century. It was during the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and his elevation of Harem Sultan, that the position was cemented. The same position in the earlier period had not been able to deliver both. By the time Harem's son, Selim II, ascended the throne, his mother had already altered the model for royal motherhood. After that, every mother of a sultan in power was known as the valid sultan, with all of its accompanying rights, staff, revenue, and rooms in the palace. But her true power came not from rank, but something even older and more dangerous, a killer's bond with his mother, from concubine to queen mother. A perilous advancement. None of the valid sultans were born to power. They were all brought into the harem as concubines, peasant girls, snatched from faraway land. Nameless, faceless, ruthless. She had endured the cutthroat politics of the harem, won a prince or sultan's heart or attention, and, most importantly, given birth to a son. But that was just the childbirth. A concubine who could not secure her son's prospects was typically exiled or worse. In the Islamic world, a woman whose son became the king. But she reached the zenith of women's power. It was something of an unlikely metamorphosis, from a silent figure behind silk curtains to a pressure that could bend imperial policy. Seat of power, her chambers, her court, her treasury. The valid sultan lived in the most splendid apartments in the harem. The valid sultan's apartments located close to the imperial quarters and the private mosque. Her chambers were opulently adorned with Iznik tiles, Persian carpets, gold-laced curtains, and jungle of ivory inlaid furniture. She was surrounded by a whole retinue, eunuchs, secretaries, maids, and senior harem women. She had her own treasury, apart from the sultan's, and her own agents to manage it. Her income, derived from imperial revenues, ranked among the empire's richest. She had access to foreign envoys through intermediaries and frequently communicated with European queens, ambassadors, and Catholic cardinals. In some cases, embassies based in Istanbul viewed the valid sultan as an independent political entity to flatter and court and, occasionally, bribe. But more than wealth and privilege, her greatest legacy was advice. The valid sultan was allowed to meet the sultan at any time. She could form his opinion of ministers, endorse candidates, or destroy enemies. She could serve as regent in cases of crisis, with her ruling in her son's name. The valid sultan in the golden age of the empire, Kaksem and Turhananli to women bearing the title, effectively went down in history as its powerful and iconic holder. Kaksem Sultan and Turhan Hetties Sultan. Anastasia, later known as Kaksem Sultan, was taken to the palace as Greek Christian girl and given to favorite of Ahmed I, of whom she had multiple sons, and in the reigns of Murad IV and Ibrahim I, she took action as the ruler. She reigned over her grandsons while they were minors as well as beyond their deaths, leading to her grandson Mehmed IV. Ironically, for 33 years, she was the most powerful person in the Ottoman court, as she negotiated with viziers, issued firmans, and controlled huge networks of patronage. But power drew enemies. Kaksem was ultimately strangled in 1651 by eunuchs loyal to her daughter, Lord Turhan Sultan, in one of the most dramatic power struggles of the 17th century. His mother Turhan Sultan, also former concubine from Ukraine, became the new valid sultan and ruled as regent to her son Mehmed IV. Like her opponent, she dominated the court, having a powerful influence in directing architecture and the arts, most notably building the Yeni Mosque of Istanbul. Their conflict was the final act of what modern historians call the Sultanate of Women. Some say it lasted 1533 to 1656, when harem women wielded power over imperial affairs. The valid in foreign affairs and diplomacy. While she was never present at the Divan Imperial Council, she held a strong role in foreign policy. Foreign embassies would come and visit her chambers with presents, letters. As a man with much respect, she could also act as a liaison between foreign queens and the sultan, especially in matters which were of religious or dynastic nature. Valid sultans are known to have acted on a number of occasions to attempt to protect a Christian minority or to enable a common diplomatic tradition, such as a treaty between the Ottomans and Europeans. This was understated but impressive. Their ability to sway the Kisla Aka's chief eunuch, who ran the harem, and also held the power of the keys, maintaining control over imperial correspondence in and out of the seraglio, afforded them access to all state matters and eddies, mothers and sons, a relationship of power, a source of tension. The relationship between a sultan and his mother was a complicated one. Princes in their early years were for every purpose an appendix of their mothers. They picked up those people skills through them, as well as diplomacy, language, and emotional intelligence. The bond between mother and son was fostered within the secluded walls of the harem, and out of the harshness of court life. but once on the throne, that dynamic might get tense. A few sultans chafed at their mothers, meddling, and others depended too much on their counselors, and thus were ruled by them like effete stooges. And others, such as Sultan Ibrahim I, depended so much on them that their mothers might be said to have ruled in their stead. In numerous reigns, the valid sultan would serve as a de facto counselor to the sultan in a relationship, indistinguishable from that between a king and his mother, and between a husband and his wife. And it seems that it was not uncommon for the latter to have been far more significant economically and politically. Philanthropy, the visible hand of the invisible. Queen valid sultans weren't just shadowy rulers, they were also philanthropists. Of the public good, they built an image of grace, piety, and generosity through enormous acts of charity. They constructed mosques, fountains, hospitals, schools, and soup kitchens, and they were not mere acts of faith, rather, they were public relations actions, selling the love and loyalty of the people. The date of death of Harem Sultan, who endowed a hospital, a madrasa, and a mosque in Haseki complex in Istanbul. Kaksım Sultan funded orphanages and mosques in the empire. Turhan Sultan's Yeni Cami remains today as a testament to her architectural vision. Charitable activities on their part were also definitely politically motivated. The Mirza General, if elected, was determined to engage in a bit of work relief feeding moths, who, with a broke tail end, were inclined to wax. Two rebellious educated moths wouldn't rebel. Enemies in the dark, assassination, kidnapping, and the battle for Sicily. The harem was no sanctuary. It was a velvet-lined battlefield. All valid sultans had their threats, jealous of the concubines, competing factions, scheming black eunuchs or power-hungry Some died of illness, others were rumored to have been poisoned. Some were horrifically murdered, strangled in the stillness of night. They waged battles with wit, alliances, and gold, not with swords. Their stories were often rewritten, diminished, or even erased by male historians even in their own victories. But their fingerprints are on the architecture, in the imperial decrees, in the quiet turns of succession and policy. The real pillars of the empire. Why the shock and awe theme does not work abroad. In the world, an Ottoman sultan bore the empire on his shoulders. In actuality, that burden was more likely carried by his mother, behind the walls of the harem. The valid sultans ruled with a mixture of maternal instinct, political acumen, and unflagging determination. They understood the stakes of every decision, not just for their sons, but for the entire empire. They were captives who became queens, servants who became sovereigns, the women who reigned over an empire without ever sitting on its throne. Next, in our next chapter, we are going to shift our attention to that more covert, but no less potent element of love and desire, to how concubines and consorts influenced the culture, sensuality, and emotional life of the Ottoman court. In the Ottoman court, desire was not just a feeling but a political tool, an art form, and a highly choreographed performance. Love was murmured from behind veils, scripted in delicate calligraphy, and danced that in-between moment between the glances. Neither romance nor sensuality ever was simply a private pleasure for the Ottoman princes and the women of the palace. They were tools of influence, expressions of strength, and at times, weapons of survival. In this chapter, we move back from the tumult of succession and the maelstrom of politics to consider a quieter, deeper force in the life of palaces. Desire. We'll journey into the realm of the ghazals, of secret meetings and poetic seduction, and of the nuanced customs that lent Ottoman love its distinctive tenor. The Ottoman view of love, flesh and spirit, combine in the Ottoman imagination shaped by Islam, Sufism, Persian mysticism, and Turkish courtly culture. Love enjoyed high status, but it was not Western-style love. Love was interpreted as both the yearning for the divine and earthly attraction. It might be religious or erotic, grand or menacing. In poetry and philosophy, love was the mirror of God's beauty. The beloved might be a man or a woman for the bewitched heart, a reflection of the divine. But that sublime ideal was coexistent with a very sensuous, aestheticizing culture. The Ottomans held beauty, pleasure, and art as gifts to be indulged while contained. The language of love, in such a system, wasn't vulgar. It was high and stylized and coded and poetic. For Ottoman princes and palace women, love was almost never easy. It was sedimented with hierarchy and duty and ambition. but it was no less powerful. The poetic court, words as wealth, and, if there was one overarching language through which desire was articulated at the Ottoman court, it was poetry. Nearly every Ottoman prince learned to write verse, typically in Persian and Ottoman Turkish, from the 15th century on. Poetry and writing was not only an art that was fun to pursue, it was an indication of sophistication, insight, and emotional range. Princes such as Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, pen name Muhibi, penned hundreds of love poems, many of which were not just inspired by but directly addressed to his beloved harem sultan. These were poems of longing, metaphor, and contained passion. You have my heart, and will always be my queen, even if I wear a different crown. Love poems often continued to use symbolic language. Ands with er4, the rose for the beloved's face, the nightingale for the poet, verth, brew for love's inebriation, the tulip for beauty and delicacy. Concubines, in fact, were educated in poetry as well. Some were able to recite Cossack Persian works, others composed poems and gave them, through intermediaries, to princes in secret. It was said that the most beautifully turned verse could enthrall a prince as much as a precious jewel. Poetry was how the powerless got to speak to the powerful, and it worked. The garden as a stage of love. Ottoman palace gardens were much more than just pretty, they were theatres for romance. These were well-planned fiefdoms, with geometric fountains, jasmine-lined pathways, and hidden pavilions, cloaked in sensual prompts. It was here that lovers, both royal and not, were made and unmade, and where princes, quite regularly, stumbled upon their inconvenient concubines in choreographed accidents. These gardens were sites of first glances, flirtations in the form of lessons in poetry or music, and jesting under the vigilant gaze of the eunuchs. Some were even trained to saunter by the prince's window, leisurely drop a handkerchief, or sing a Persian ghazal, loud enough to be barely audible. They were all deliberate, each one thought out in advance. Desire within the Ottoman court was a play, and everyone knew their part. Romance under surveillance, love in a cage. Despite the finesse and aesthetic of courtly love, desire in the Ottoman palace was just as much governed. For concubines, unbudgeable would-be love could mean punishment or exile. For princes, loving the wrong woman also could imperil their future. All displays of affection were tracked, whispered about, potentially a commodity. But love was not always to be caged. There were secret relationships, too, between princes and concubines who had not yet found their official mansions. Some were facilitated by sympathetic eunuchs, others uncovered only after the concubine became pregnant. Refracting desires became grist for the courtroom mill, and all too often the source of political retribution. There are stories of such women vanishing under suspicious circumstances after they have been accused of bewitching a prince, and yet love endured, soft and stubborn. Tremendous loves, Suleiman and harem as a case. There is no love story to which poetry and politics are more closely entwined, so much as that of Suleiman the Magnificent and harem sultan. Suleiman, a world-famous poet with the pen name Muhibi, was a great lawgiver, strictly obeying the system of law and fond of his favorite harem. This really made a lot of people uncomfortable, because he set an example to the statesmen of the future by changing the 300-year-old Ottoman law. She had ensnared him not only by her beauty, but by her raillery, learning, and grace. Their letters compose an emotionally charged correspondence, filled with tenderness and love, genuine respect for each other, and of course their growing love for one another. My darling, my sultana, my one and only... This romance set the empire on edge. Harem not only gained control of the imperial court and affairs of state, but also played a decisive role in the destiny of the Ottoman Empire, beginning with the reign of her husband to that of her sons, and finally to the rule of her grandson. Their romantic partnership was also a direct translation into empire building. For others, it was the most quintessentially Ottoman love story there is. For others, it was evidence that love could pervert imperial objectivity. But one thing is clear: the empire was never the same again. Sensuality and the arts, art, culture, and the love of beauty in the Ottoman court. Desire was anything but confined to the bedroom. It was embedded in the arts, fashion, music, and rituals of beauty. Perfume was a necessity. Jasmine, rose, musk, sandalwood. That the textiles were sumptuous: silk kaftans, velvet sashes, slippers woven with strands of gold. Jewelry was heavy with symbolism. Each stone represented rank or mood or allegiance. Feminine ensembles played and sung music, accompanied by instruments like oud, ney, and konan, that combined feelings of longing and coquetry. Miniature painting would frequently show lovers in stylized gardens, metaphors for desire in whispers of metaphor. Coffee ceremonies, introduced in the 16th century, were also charged with sensuality. Coffee might be served to a prince by a concubine with a tiny inclination of the head, a small raised brow, a small slow smile. Whole affairs had started on the point of a porcelain cup. These arts were not frivolous. They were the tools of seduction, of identity, of power. Female desire. A subtle power when history does tell the story of men who desired. The Ottoman harem was filled with intelligent, sensual women who knew how to navigate love and longing for themselves. A lot of concubines managed to claim their place on the totem pole by virtue of desire, but not sheer subterfuge. These women actively cultivated beauty, talent, and mystery. Some became confidants, others advisors. Some really fell in love, and some didn't. Desire was weapon and escape. Their legacy. The poetry of concubines is rare to be preserved, but did on occasion survive in collections and oral tradition. Their songs were full of desire, anger, love, yearning to be free. I blossomed under cypress trees, but my roots longed for sunlight. This was no innocent flirtation. It was the voice of women trapped in a gilded cage. When love turned deadly in an environment where every relationship was politically tinged, romantic passion could all too easily devolve into danger. Tangled up in jealousy and rivalry, concubines accused of poisoning rivals, punished princes for lost love, get lovers, turned into adversaries in the game of power. There was, for instance, the lethal competition between Harem Sultan and Mahidevran, who was another consort of Suleiman and the mother of his first son, Mustafa. Their rivalry generated political intrigue and brutal execution of Prince Mustafa, possibly due to the manipulation of roxelana. Desire in the Ottoman palace was never innocent. It could raise or ruin, embolden or betray. Conclusion. The empire of the Hatin, the empire of swords and scrolls. The most brutal battles were often fought, not on the battlefield, but in the heart. The connections between Ottoman princes and palace women were informed by longing, imagination, and the orchestrations of carefully cultivated romance. From poetry to perfume, gardens to glances, it drifted like the smell of rose oil on a summer breeze through the Imperial palace. Sweet, heavy, and indelible. Not only mother or vizier, but beloved, stood behind the Sultan. And behind each poem was the quiet force of a woman who understood how to translate love into legacy. In the next chapter, we'll consider what happened once those feelings of love reached the point of children, and how sons were raised in a palace made of beauty and betrayal, and the cycle of power recommenced. To be the son of a sultan is to be born into privilege and peril. Ottoman princes Layezids were heirs from the moment they took their first breath, heirs to a fortune and a fantasy, as well as to a relentless life of rivalry, surveillance, and peril. Their lullabies were whispered behind velvet curtains, and their toys set beside miniature swords. Their tutors were told to teach, not just convey and test. In this chapter, we delve into the complex and dangerous childhoods of Ottoman princes, how they were raised, educated, and groomed to rule, all while understanding that only one could live to wear the crown. Birth of a Kezid, a moment of joy. A warning of Waray's son's birth to a concubine in the harem was a joyous occasion, but also the start of undeclared warfare. The moment a woman gave birth to a male child, she was promoted and provided her own apartments in the palace, forming a body of eunuchs, servants, and wet nurses around them. Messages were surreptitiously sent to important courtiers, and the whispers found their way through the corridors. A new player had emerged in the imperial game, but every prince's birth was also a birth of rivalry. The mothers of the other princes looked on anxiously. It caught the attention of the chief black eunuch. Even the Sultan himself, while rejoicing, knew the implications. Another son meant another threat to the future in the struggle for the succession. Childhood would not be innocent for the young prince, but a training in survival. The world of the harem, the prince's infant life. For the first 6 to 7 years, princes lived in the harem with their mothers and other women to care for them. They were nurtured in a world of softest silks, murmured prayers, poetry, and rigorous silence of court ritual, far from the public life of the empire. Their early caretakers included nurses, who by attachment to the prince, formed a permanent bond of loyalty. Harem mistresses taught court etiquette. Girl tutors commenced the teaching of reading Quran and basic etiquette. Tape Prince was kept from harm during these years, but not from contingency. Even this kid with yellow hair could see how his mother worked him over with her rivals. He witnessed the silent power struggles, and before he was really old enough to comprehend it, he had the burden of his own future to bear. Education begins. Tutors, governors, and spiritual guidance. Education began early and was rigorous. An Ottoman prince's education was not training in philosophy or poetry. It was intended to turn him into a ruler, a general, a man of sword and pen. Subjects included Quran and Hadith, to solidify him in Islamic jurisprudence and ethical leadership, Turkish, Ottoman, Arabic, and Persian, for language, diplomacy, and culture. Calligraphy, the art of elegant writing. Calligraphy, the noble art of writing, and the secreto, power and grace derived from precision. Islamic and Ottoman, often historical and geographical. Martial training, archery, swordsmanship, horseback riding, some strategy later honed. Princes enjoyed a multitude of loli teachers such as ulama, religious scholars, officers, and occasionally men who had spent time abroad. The wisest teachers were carefully appointed, for they molded the prince's intellect and viewpoint, not only on law, war, and politics. Apart from men of letters, a high-ranking courtier and mentor, Alala was also appointed at his side as his political advisor and personal counselor. This number would dog him into his first governorship and stick to him for years. Arts, music, and poetry. Culture. The king's Deutano Ottoman prince was considered complete without grounding in the arts. For all its origins in a martial, sturdy empire, HW was a firm believer in the necessity of artistic cultivation for rulers. Princes learned to recite and create poetry in the ghazal format. Circuit. The ney. It feels as the ney alludes to being the Muhammad of all instruments. Savor. Miniature painting, architecture, and ceramics. Discuss philosophy, literature, and ethics, all in salon-like discussions. This education in the arts was not just window dressing. It trained in restraint, elegance, and emotional intelligence. It taught princes how to handle poets, artists, and foreign diplomats. This allowed them to express themselves indirectly in the language of courtly love, or of political allegory. Numerous future sultans, such as Suleiman the Magnificent, were also accomplished poets. A prince among brothers. Rivals begins. Ottoman princes were not equals even in childhood. Each mother forcibly worked to secure the future of her son, through alliances with eunuchs, gifts to viziers, and control of tutors. A child might pick up on whispers that compare him to his brothers. He would notice which mother was favored, which tutor more indulgent, which eunuch a covert courier to another faction of the harem. At times, brothers played together in good, clean fun, but suspicion frequently intensified with age. Both knew that only one could inherit the empire, and that fact had a strong influence on the way they related to one another. Behind every lesson, every game, and every gesture was the shadow that this was all leading to an ultimate parting, and, possibly, a war. The Sancak journey to have been an experience of passage. When the prince turned 12 to 15, he was taken from Istanbul and sent to a Sanjak provincial district to govern. This was no period of exile, it was a last test. The Sancaks contained such important towns as Manisa, Magna Salam, Almazia, Amazia, Tripis, Energy Trebizond, and Katayachivam, strategically important or difficult to manage. The prince was the governor of the Sancak. He commanded his own court, made judgments, managed tax gathering, and, as necessary, led soldiers. He became, as it were, a shadow king, readying for a future throne or a succession battleground. Accompanying him were his Lala, tutor, mentor, his personal guard, his scribes and advisors, a few faithful bakewives, who may include his mother. The move was crucial for the prince's mother. She would now have greater freedom to define her son's court, and to launch political campaigns back in the capital. These were the provincial courts, which turned into training grounds, election laboratories, and webs of influence. Every prince a power center, and by extension, a mini-threat. Dispatched from the capital, spies in politics with the princes. Distance served only as a reminder of the palace, never allowing them to disappear into the unknown beyond. The central government dispatched inspectors, received secret reports, and looked for signs of ambition, constantly observing whether a powerful local official was drifting into decadent. The prince who won too much support might be called back, or worse, even communication between princes and their mothers in the capital was intercepted. Suspicions of insubordination, profligacy, or perfidy were brought to the Sultan or the Grand Vizier. It needed so little. Even an ill-considered speech by a prince could lead to the precipice. Some learned to proceed with caution, retain loyalists, while also working quietly to shore up support. Some acted boldly and were punished. Case studies: princes who worked and those who didn't. Suleiman the Magnificent was my governor in Manisa. I had learned to appreciate him for his reforms and humbleness. His letters to his father display political sagacity and moderation. The son of Suleiman, Prince Mustafa, was popular in his Sancak of Amasya, being regarded as generous and wise. A victim of his own success, Harem Sultan and the Grand Vizier, Rustam Pasha, are rumored to have conspired against him. His father, who was afraid of rebellion, had him slain. Selim II, called Selim the Sot, was literate and a poet, but derogated for debauchery. But, under Harem's sway and meticulous political training, he ascended to the throne without a drop of blood spilt. Another son of Suleiman, Prince Bayezid, turned against his brother Selim after being summoned back to the capital. He was eventually apprehended and executed by Persian authorities, with the approval of the Ottoman Empire. These narratives expose that it wasn't only the education and sheer skill that allow one to survive. Timing, alliances, and luck all played their parts. Isolation and the disappearance of the Sancak tradition gradually. The Sancak system was abolished, and by the 17th century, princes were locked up in the palace rather than being sent out to rule. To a section known as the Kafes, the cage. It did this in order to avoid rebellions and civil wars, but it had unintended consequences. Isolated princes grew to be emotionally stunted, politically naive, or even insane. Some grew paranoid, angry, or indifferent. Few received real education. Their contacts were only with eunuchs or servants. This change brought an end to the career of the prince-statesman and marked the rise of the puppet sultans, manipulated by the palace. In conclusion, the fragile path to power the Ottoman prince's childhood was paradoxical. He was pampered and imprisoned at the same time, and empowered and endangered. He learned to read poems with one hand, a dagger in the other. He memorized the Quran, keeping his eyes on his brothers for signs of competition. Silas was bred for magnificence and cautioned never to want it too much. Some succeeded, some were undone by their own skill, others just vanished into the silence of the palace walls. But all Ottoman princes knew one thing, that never would love, loyalty, and even learning save them. Only victory could. In the next chapter, we will focus on those who kept the best eye on the princes, the eunuchs of the palace. Frequently overlooked, these men ruled the halls of power and determined the destinies of prince and concubine alike. There was a group of men who moved through the Ottoman palace, heart of that empire whose economy was secrets, whose language was whispers. This group was little known but beyond fear. They had no sons, no wives, and no descendants. Desire had been wrung out of them, not ambition. They were the eunuch's servants, spies, protectors, kingmakers. To the outside world, they were mute shadows, scarcely more than servants of the household. But at the same time, eunuchs had become essential to the functioning of palace and state within the empire. Their strength was nowhere more visible than in the imperial harem, where they served as the Sultan's gatekeeper to his most private world. In this select chapter, we reveal the saga of the palace eunuchs, the extraordinary men who went from slaves to statesmen, who forged imperial politics, and who protected the very future of empire. What is a eunuch? A life of sacrifice and service. Eunuch simply is a neutered man. In the Ottoman world, eunuchs tended to be enslaved boys from places as diverse as Ethiopia, Sudan, or, less commonly, parts of the Balkans and the Caucasus, who had been castrated, often under unimaginably brutal circumstances, and then sold into imperial service. There were two main categories: black eunuchs, Kisla, Akalara, predominantly of sub-Saharan African origin. They served in the harem and rose to some of its most powerful positions. White eunuchs, Kapi Akalara, European origin, often Christian convert eunuchs, who worked as janissaries for the Ender and as administrative staff. The black eunuchs were actually the most politically powerful, acting as go-betweens for the women of the harem and the sultan, and even guarding the entrance to the throne room. They had no blood ties, no dynasties, but they had something else: the proximity to power. The chief black eunuch Kisla, a kosk, main function to oversee the running of the harem. The harem is an area of the palace where female family members, servants, and especially in the Uyghur and harem eunuch Kisla Emaneti concubines lived. The most senior eunuch at the Ekla Kapask was the Kisla Akaski, chief black eunuch. Far from a mere servant, this man was more powerful than any vizier. He possessed the keys to the gates of the harem. He managed who could see the sultan's mother, wives, and concubines. He looked after millions of dollars in tax money and supervised hundreds of women's staff at the palace. And most importantly, he managed the private communications between the harem's women and the outside. This meant he could manipulate court politics. He could order a concubine's rise or fall. He could manipulate the succession by backing one prince or another. He closely held confidential information, documents and negotiations of imperial consequence. The Kisla Kosk had his own wing of the palace, his own treasury, his own guards, and even controlled religious endowments, especially the pious endowments, or vakifs, which paid for mosques and schools. The eunuchs and the harem, masters of the inner court. Despite all that appears in myth, the eunuchs didn't actually reside in the harem, but alongside it, in special buildings of their own. But what the supporters did inside was crucial. They escorted concubines and valid sultans, delivered messages, jewelry, and gifts, maintained security, prevented unauthorized entry, supervised punishments and ceremonies. They were both bodyguards and diplomats, taught how to read mood, silence dissent, and serve loyally without ever saying a word to many. No one but they could go in and out of the harem. Assignments could also include advising powerful women like Kasem Sultan or Harem Sultan on how to navigate political dangers, or delivering secret correspondence to allies outside a blue-tiled palace. They were both absent and necessary. Spies and kingmakers, what they did to help succession among the most feeble and the strongest, that is, the employment be done by the king's eunuchs, used to be in the successions of kings. After the sultan's death, or when he is too ill, the Kisla Kosk could also tell a prince-elect. He could give messages to rivals time to fall flat. He could smuggle weapons or messages access to the valid sultan, who frequently played a crucial role in promoting one son over another. Was his at times. Eunuchs even facilitated the clandestine killing of concubines or princes that threatened the regime. They were entrusted with such grim duties because they were deemed neutral and had only a loyalty to the sultanate itself, not any family. But neutrality was an illusion. Some of the eunuchs took sides and began to influence the future of the empire. Dawning in the shadows, eunuchs and the majestic power of the empire. Numerous eunuchs reached tremendous stature, like for example Haji Bashir Akka, who was a Kosk from the age of 34, more than 30 years in the 18th century. He controlled vast wealth, influenced succession politics, managed extensive endowments in Mecca and Medina, and corresponded with foreign ambassadors. Another was Mehmed Akka, who rose to prominence in the early 17th century under Kasem Sultan, where he played a crucial role in aiding the valid and in the selection of viziers. Eunuchs had networks outside the palace as well. They owned properties, funded religious institutions, constructed mosques and schools. Benefactors of Bashir Kami of Istanbul wrote to local governors and judges throughout the empire. In practice, despite their origins as serfs, they acted as rulers during periods of systemic weakness. The eunuch's dilemma: power and gender in the Ottoman court. Power came with being a eunuch, but at a tremendous price. Most were abducted from their families as children, castrated and forced into an alien culture. They were usually religious Muslims, but many thought they occupied the periphery of society. Employed, but never completely accepted, except that their loyalty was total, and yet always in doubt. Sultans also were worried that eunuchs would become too powerful. Valid sultans watched them closely. Grand viziers tried to weaken them, and sometimes they got blamed for failing policy. Punishment could be swift. A single whiff of betrayal could lead to exile, execution, or, worse yet, suffocation in a sack and being drowned in the Bosphorus, a punishment more than once mentioned in palace records. EUNUCHS. And religion being custodians of the holy cities. One of his chief roles was as the guardian of the holy places, particularly Mecca and Medina. The Kisler Akosk managed Vakif's charitable endowments that provided for pilgrims, established hospitals and fountains, and supported the recitation of the Quran in the holy cities. That gave him extraordinary control over religious networks and further bolstered his political power. He can even propose names of religious judges and scholars, administrators. In fact, in the empire, especially in Arab provinces, in that respect, eunuchs were not just imperial servants, but protectors of Islamic values. The decline of eunuch's power diminished by the 19th century, the decline of the harem in the course of modernization of the Ottoman Empire, clarification needed, meant the obscurity of valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. Although her political and social initiatives could promote her to a central position, under Mehmed II and Abdul Masih, the traditional duties of the Ottoman court were abandoned and regularized. Their harem, too, was once no longer of any political significance, yet even in their decline, the eunuchs left a legacy in the palaces they built, the policies they created, the gossip that wove like ivy between the walls of Topkapi. Conclusion: silent architects of empire, the eunuchs of the Ottoman palace were not simply guards or servants, but rather builders of power, curators of secrets, and stewards of the Sultan's internal world. By silence, by allegiance, by manipulation, they determined the fate of princes and concubines alike. They did not seek glory, they left behind no heirs, but their fingerprints are on every velvet curtain, every sealed letter, and every shadowed step behind the throne. They were the empire's mute power, and without them, the palace would have collapsed long before it finally did. In the next chapter we come back to the personal and the psychological, how a life without freedom and under constant observation left some profound emotional scars, particularly in the case of women, who found themselves confined not just behind walls, but inside roles they could never escape. The Ottoman imperial harem was a world filled with beauty, luxury, and secrecy, but it was also a gilded prison. It sparkled with silk and gold, but its walls were the bars of a prison, where 1,000 women lived under the burden of rule, rivalries, and 24-hour surveillance. The harem was home and battlefield to the women who inhabited its confines. Love intertwined with fear, authority with helplessness. Survival required perpetual vigilance. In this chapter, we explore the emotional and psychological challenges of harem living, how separation fed into jealousy, how women countered the fragility of their situation, and how resourcefulness determined their destinies. The harem system, separated from the world harem, is an Arabic term, arjami, meaning forbidden or sacred, and referring to a set-aside place where few can enter. The Ottoman harem was home to hundreds, if not thousands, of women, from the Sultan's mother and wives, and concubines to servants, ladies-in-waiting, and even female officials. Its complex hierarchy included valide Sultan, Queen Mother, the absolute Sultan of the harem Qada, Nasa Iqbals, legal wives, and preferred concubines, Qari Gizds, low-ranking concubines and female slaves, Kalfas and Hazi Adars, higher servants and treasury keepers. EUNUCHS, male guardians and gatekeepers. In this world, the women endured the strictures of behavior, dress, and association. Stuck inside, behind walls, physical and emotional distance, they all lived in the bustling harem, but the harem was a lonely place, too. Women were isolated from the outside world, their families, and from any semblance of normal social life. The outside world was reached through eunuchs and intermediaries. Reports from the empire's far-flung territories came in haphazardly. The harem had its own rituals, festivals, and ceremonies, too, but all were constrained by palace walls. This isolation often led to feelings of loneliness and longing anxiety over uncertain futures in the harem. Alliances depended on the same devices. Competing for the Sultan's favor was a fierce affair for a lot of women. The harem was simultaneously a golden prison, an arena where dreams and fears played out, and jealousy and rivalry, the politics of affection, survival, and advancement depended on the Sultan's favor. Jealousy, therefore, was often present as an underlying factor for relationships. Women competed to be noticed with beauty, wit, music, poetry, and acts of loyalty. The ascendancy of one concubine might be the ruin or exile of another. In those days, rivalries were not only personal, of course, but political. Women stood for various ethnic groups, families or factions. A eunuch or courtier in one's corner could mean survival or damnation. You hear stories of intrigue and sabotage, poisoned drinks, whispers, secret alliances, publicly hurled accusations. On the line was life or death, motherhood and power. What only mothers can do to become the mother of a prince could change a woman's status overnight. Mothers of princes, and especially the valid sultan, wielded extraordinary power. But motherhood also presented fresh challenges. Guarding the child from rivals and assassins, negotiation of court politics to ensure the child's succession, affection with political necessity. Mothers established networks of support and patronage, and occasionally went to ruthless extremes to protect their sons. But many also felt tremendous love, fear and sacrifice, knowing their child's survival might be the key to their own safety or destruction. Culture and religion, rituals of comfort and control. Religion was central to the rhythm of the harem. Daily prayers, the recitation of the Quran, festivals, and the trading of obligations and favors constituted time, and spiritually legitimated the trust of the sultan and valid sultan. Music, dance, and storytelling could all offer relief and pleasure from daily cares, but had to be closely monitored to ensure no transgression of propriety. Women practiced arts such as calligraphy and embroidery, primarily as pen and needle play and as status symbols. These rituals built community but also preserved discipline and order. Mental health and trauma, their hidden wounds. But as splendid as it was, the harem was a weighty psychological burden. Isolation, the fear of displacement, jealousy, the eternal need to be on guard, all led to stress, depression, and occasionally even madness. According to historical records, women were reported to be dying of despair or locked up after displaying erratic behavior. Other women managed with religion, art, or the forming of intense relationships with others. Others became hardened, pragmatic survivors. The harem's emotional terrain was as intricate as its political counterpart. Escape and freedom, few and far between, and dangerous escape, too, from the harem was possible, though unusual. Some women were released by the sultan, the valid sultan, or by falling pregnancy or growing too old to bear children. Others might be married to favored courtiers or diplomats, but escape was dangerous. Trying to escape without approval was punishable by death, let alone severe punishment. Freedom, for many, was something of a mirage, something spoken of only in poetry or a prayer. Legacy of the harem women. Yet, even within these restrictive boundaries, certain harem women left their mark. They were also benefactors of architecture, the arts and charity. They influenced imperial culture and policy, sometimes through informal conduits. Their lives and love stories, their losses and triumphs, and their encounters with power have always captivated and challenged the contemporary imagination. They weren't just victims, and they weren't just villains. Rather, they were complex actors in an environment of oppression and opportunity. Conclusion: life behind the veil. The Ottoman harem was full of contradictions. It was extravagant and grotesque, loving and treacherous, powerful and enslaving. For the women behind the walls, survival meant wit, bravery and ingenuity. Their lives not only molded the sultans they gave birth to or served, but also the direction of Ottoman history itself. In the following chapter, we shall press forward with the story of the Ottoman princes and see how they encountered the stern facts of succession, their combats, their victories, their disasters. The most dangerous theater was not the battlefield or the council chamber, but the bedchamber. The throne was a prize, and only one could sit on it. For Ottoman princes, a path to power was paved with competition, treachery, and frequently death. In this chapter we now turn to the cutthroat reality of Ottoman succession, the rules that governed it, the intense sibling rivalry it engendered, and the often tragic consequences for those who stood in the path of empire. The Ottoman AQT, Robiate, so far as it survives in printed text, which seems always to have been scanty, becomes among many other collections of laws, Florida Noxa Mencio Frag. Unlike some European monarchies, which followed a system of primogeniture that automatically passed rule to the oldest son, the Ottomans did not have a system in place with a constitution or law on succession. Instead, power went to the prince who was the strongest, most powerful, who had gotten the most support in a palace coup, and sometimes who had the best luck. This was survival of the fittest, a zero-sum rivalry rife with fratricide and backstabbing. Sultans rarely named heirs explicitly. When the ruler died, numerous princes hurried to Istanbul to assert their claim to the throne. Who won would be the man who could garner the backing of the janissaries, palace officials, and powerful people in the palace. Fratricide, the dark tradition, and, in the name of preventing civil war, a disturbing policy was born. Fratricide, the killing of rival brothers. It was officially established with the reign of Mehmed II, the Conqueror, though some members of the Ottoman dynasty practiced fratricide before this time. Succession systems involved the execution of all brothers and male cousins who might be potential claimants to the Sultan's throne. When a new Sultan came to power, brutal as it was, this policy was understood as a sad requirement in the Ottoman cultural attitude toward politics. The psychological toll on princes being afraid that their brothers would be shot by the hand of themselves. Princes knew only too well the constant threat, seeing allies become enemies overnight, weighing every word, every gesture. Many took preemptive action to remove rivals. Others tried to form alliances, marry for protection, or bestow political favors. Princes were formed in this environment. Some grew cold and calculating. Some became secretive watchers, and some remained expansive to the ideas of others. Valid. Sultan and the harem in politics. The women of the harem, particularly the valid sultan, the sultan's mother, were crucial in succession politics. Mothers competed against one another to seat their sons upon the ringed throne, even exerting sway with court officials, eunuchs, and military commanders. They played politics, made alliances, and occasionally schemed for the fall of rival princes. The harem was more than a domestic space. However, it was a political battlefield, where the destiny of future sultans was often determined. Military and administrative support. It was these actual and potential janissary corps, governors of provinces, and officials of the government, who had to be reckoned with. Those princes who arranged such marriage became more likely to succeed. Provincial governors could supply troops and resources. The janissaries could uphold the claim in Istanbul. Many a contention for these loyalties was ended with bribery, with empty promises, or even assassination. Historical examples of succession. Struggles. Bayezid II and Sem Sultan. A good old-fashioned rivalry between brothers. Sem contested Bayezid's succession, and civil war and subsequent exiling were the outcome. Selim I, the Grim, a cold-blooded killer, who had his path to the throne paved with the corpses of his brothers and nephews. Suleiman the Magnificent. Upon reaching the throne, he had his own brother killed to ensure that he wouldn't threaten his position. A wise preemptive measure to make sure your rule goes unchallenged. Prince Mustafa. He falls victim to the killer machinations of a palace, dominated by factions and rampant political intrigue. These cases demonstrate a cycle of violence, but also political complication and strange bedfellows. The end of fratricide in the caste system. During the 17th century, the use of fratricide decreased and was eventually replaced by the caifs, or cage system. Princes were instead kept within the palace, locked away in a remote part of the complex, known as the caifs, where they were kept guarded but safe from outside dangers. While it saved the lives of these nobles, the psychological stress was immense. Many of these princes became insane from lack of human contact. The caifs system was a departure from violent removal to incarceration. Legacy of succession rivalry. The brutal system helped define the nature of Ottoman rulership, and with it fostered vigilance, pragmatism, and at times cruelty. In it, civil wars from succession crises led to weak central authority and destabilized empire at times, but it enabled the empire to avert extended civil wars that might have sundered it, and preserved the peace that so much of the ancient world long endured. Conclusion. The price of power. The throne was a prize worth any cost for Ottoman princes, but it was a cost often paid by their own family, by their own sanity, and in the end, by their own lives. The shadows of succession darkened every passageway, every whisper that scuttled between brothers. In the following chapter, we'll take a closer look at the women who helped steer these struggles, a host of mothers, sisters, and concubines who worked behind the scenes to shift the course of history. Behind every Ottoman sultan was a woman, and often a more powerful and influential woman than many would suspect. Empire and princes lived and died. Politics of the Ottoman dynasty was determined by mothers, mothers-in-law, and palace women. In these pages, we reveal the tales of these powerful females' calculations, ambitions, alliances, and, sometimes, brutal machinations to control the succession and then the government of the empire. Valid Sultan, Queen Mother's Roli, the mother of the reigning Sultan. The valid Sultan was considered top woman in the empire and enjoyed major power. Her influence extended across the harem, maintaining and organizing its daily operations. The palace, access to the Sultan and key officials. The empire, advising the Sultan and occasionally serving as regent for underage heirs. If anything, the valid Sultan was often the most politically savvy, being at court. She handled court intrigues, made alliances, and molded the course of the state. The emergence of the valuable Sultan, a Hellstalker Ba'Sikj, Aru and Ditha. Importance of the valid Sultan was not lost on the 16th and 17th centuries, especially thanks to characters of the likes of Harim Sultan's groundbreaking case of being the wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, and then for Kaiksem Sultan, who quite simply was the one who ran the throne with her influence over multiple sultans. These women patronized architecture and religious institutions, operated enormous networks of informants and spies, right of veto in the nomination of and judges, negotiated with foreign diplomats. They had both open and clandestine power, power that was admired, feared, and at times resented. Political approaches of the valid Sultan. The valid Sultan employed several tactics in order to stabilize her son's rule, as well as to increase her influence. Alliance building with eunuchs, mainly the chief black eunuch. Managing employment in the harem and palace administrations, marriage contracts for her children, securing alliances, leveraging good deeds and public piety to strengthen credibility, handling competition within the harem, often from a political standpoint. She was a survivor of herself, her son, her lineage, the Sultan's wives and concubines, power behind the throne, great queens and warriors from Boudica to Elizabeth. If valid Sultan's power came from her son, but other women in the harem had power too. They were often there, largely because they formed personal relationships with the Sultan. Cadon's official wives could rise to political significance, especially if they gave birth to sons. Ikbal's favorite concubines were able to gain status, thanks to the Sultan's influence. Knowledge of music, poetry and diplomacy helped women make themselves attractive and win over power. Others served as go-betweens for the Sultan and palace officials, and they were often the Sultan's most trusted and adroit counsel. Notable women of influence. Sultan converted from a slave to a legal wife, influencing policy and succession. Kaiksem Sultan, acting regent for several sultans, held enormous political influence. Nurbanu Sultan affected foreign policy and succession of the empire under Tiga Safiya Sultan, acted as the leader of palace politics during the Long War. Their stories tell of women who navigated palace politics and left their imprints on Ottoman history. Women's networks, alliances, and rivalries. Women in the palace spun intricate webs. According to their common family relations, ethnicity, and loyalty, they collaborated with eunuchs and visitors, as well as other officials. Competitions could be brutal, sometimes ending with banishment, or worse. Support for arts, charities, and religious institutions served to influence. Some women financed cultural initiatives to increase their prestige. Such networks were an essential survival line in the uncertain world of the royal succession. The impact of women's power on the Succession and women often upheld their sons' right to the throne, brought down opposing candidates with intrigue or persuasion, served as regents or advisors in periods when sultans were minors or debilitated, influenced military and administrative appointments, negotiated marriages to secure alliances. They were effectively able to make or break sultans and influence empire-wide policies. Challenges and limits. Despite their influence, women faced fighting back against male officials and religious figures. Constant surveillance and political danger. The fragility of power bound up in their sons' rule. The constant risk of being sent into exile or executed if they fell out of favor with their faction. It also took political smarts, patience, and, at times, cold-bloodedness. Legacy. A new look on Ottoman politics. The impact of women changed the Ottoman court into a space of men's gendered activity and into a site of women's non-negligible agency. Their impact is visible in architectural masterpieces they commissioned, Political decisions. They shaped cultural patronage. They supported the very succession of sultans. They redefined what it meant to hold power from behind the throne. Conclusion. Queens behind the crown. The Ottoman Imperial harem was not only a world of sequestration, but also a breeding ground of political power, wherein women were active political actors in a profound and lasting manner. Through love, loyalty and rivalry, these women, who had the ear of Zia themselves, influenced the early history of the empire. In the next chapter, we turn to the Ottoman princes as rulers, how they governed on the throne, the play between tradition, reform, and the immense burden of their inheritance. The rise to the throne had been a fight, a competition, a game of survival. But for Ottoman princes who ascended to become sultans, it served as the start of a new struggle, ruling an empire that spanned 3 continents and millions of subjects. In this chapter we delve into how the Ottoman sultans ruled, making tradition and innovation work together, holding absolute political power, and having a lasting impact on the history of the world. The absolute monarch, power and obligation. Ottoman Sultan was an absolute monarch who had more power than, and was revered more than any other ruler in the country. Living at the palace in Constantinople and ruling with the opinion of the council from the advisors, he was the caliph, the defender of Sunni Islam, commanding-in-chief of the army and navy, lawgiver and final, judicial authority, arts, architecture, academia, and patronage. He spoke, and it was done. But he ruled in a complex web of advisors, viziers, and religious scholars. The sultan's role in government. Though the sultan was the supreme authority, the daily administration of the empire was the responsibility of the Grand Vizier and the Imperial Council. On war, diplomacy and succession, the sultan took major decisions. He also approved nominations of governors, judges, and generals. He was in charge of religious and benevolent institutions. He led battle campaigns in person during wars, but his involvement was not consistent. Some sultans governed actively, others delegated. Balancing tradition and reform. The Ottoman sultans inherited a distinguished past, but inherited evolving threats, from internal rebellions to European enemies. Some sultans embraced reform. Selim III attempted military modernization. Mahmud II disbanded the Janissary infantry, while some funneled money into infrastructure, education, or legal codes. But reform was frequently thwarted by conservative elites and clerics. Sultans, as patrons of culture. Numerous sultans were patrons of art, architecture, and literature. Suleimani Mosque, built by Suleiman the Magnificent. Sultans upheld poets, calligraphers, and historians. They amassed manuscripts and built libraries. This sponsorship of culture served to bolster their legitimacy and make their rule an eternal one. Challenges of succession and stability. Sultans ruled, but they still faced the violent succession crises that endangered their Moen. Wooing the loyalty of military and bureaucratic high officials was essential. Skill was required to manage relationships with the provincial governors and with the widely contrasted peoples. Religious legitimacy needed constant reinforcement. The spectre of fratricide and palace plotting often lurked behind the throne. The Sultan's personal compound and a magifold-up child dance of the grandchild of the Sultan of Morocco. The private life of the Sultan. The Sudan, the Sultan of Morocco holding a family council. The entrance to the courts at Darjaret II. The beautifully ruinous palace entrance at Darjaret I. Dynamiter and the Sultan of Morocco. Sudanese chiefs. The Sultan's private life and public appearance. Anyone who has had the good fortune to see Sultan Abdulaziz only a few years and to observe the expression of stupid complacency spread over his fat features will now be inclined to pity. Sultans meticulously controlled their public image through ritual, festival, and theatre. They had to walk the line between accessibility and the mystique of divine right. Loyalty was inculcated through teaching good behavior, generosity, and justice. But many sultans battled with isolation, loneliness, and the crushing weight of power. Are also legacy of Ottoman sultans. Sultans leave complicated legacies. A few expanded the empire's boundaries and strengthened the central administration. Others led declines but tried reforms. The legacy of their cultural and architectural contributions continues. The political choices they made determined both regional and world history. Their reigns were characterized by ambition, wisdom, and humanity. Conclusion. The crown's burden. Being sultan was not just a victory, it was the beginning of a great responsibility. continuous challenges, and the delicate act of maintaining that fine balance between power and preservation. The sultans who successfully struck this balance cemented the empire's place in history. In the next chapter, we'll return to the women of the palace, their patronage, political maneuvering, and cultural impact beyond the harem walls. Although the Ottoman palace women were behind the veil and the walls of the harem, their effect seems to resonate outside of the harem walls. By their patronage, diplomacy, and cultural leadership, they molded the artistic, religious, and social fabric of the empire. In this chapter, we consider how the women of the Ottoman palace grew into influential patrons, cultural symbols, and empire-making individuals in their own right. The tradition of female patronage palace women, including the valid sultan and favorite consorts, were the sponsors, mosques and religious complexes, college schools and libraries, fountains and baths, charitable institutions, vakifs. Such patronage was a religious obligation, but also a vehicle for exercising power and prestige. Architectural masterpieces. Some of the most obvious legacies of the palace women are architectural. One early example is the Haseki Sultan complex in Istanbul, which included a mosque, hospital, and soup kitchen, commissioned by Harem Sultan, mosques and charitable foundations that were endowed by Kasım Sultan and Nurbanu Sultan. These were both religious and social initiatives, and involved education, medicine, and welfare. The buildings they sponsored enriched the life of the city, and grew them to immortality. Support for the arts. Lady of the palace of poetry and literature, music and dance, calligraphy, and manuscript production. They created cultural salons in the palace and patronized artists and intellectuals. Some women were also poets and musicians in their own right, who actively shaped Ottoman cultural life. Religious and social influence. Palace women reshaped the social texture through vakifs and religious foundations. They built Quranic schools to guarantee the continuity of religious education, maintained Sufi orders, and ulama worked for social and charitable causes. These actions enhanced their moral authority and image in the public eye. Political implications of patronage. Patronage was also power politics. By spending on public works, women wanted to show that the sultanate was benign. They made common cause with religious leaders and local elites. Their schemes helped to bind subjects in loyalty. Charities made them more influential in imperial and provincial politics. Harem patronage allowed women influence outside the harem. Challenges and criticisms. Yet, powerful as they were, women's public roles were not always admired. They felt it was illegitimate. Conservatives considered their power illegitimate. It was even said that it was turning to a violation of imperial resources for women. But it was with circumspection and propriety that these women upheld the dictates of the social code. Their contributions, however, remain undeniable. Legacy. Names that touched our hearts and lives. Many of the buildings, charities and cultural institutions initiated by palace women remain as lasting testaments to their vision and agency. They determined not only the topography but the culture and the spirituality of the Ottoman world. Their legacy appends contemporary assumptions about gender and power in history. Conclusion. Beyond the harem walls and palace, women were not simply silent drones in a harem. Thanks to patronage and culture, they exerted an influence across the empire, spanning the bounds of power and piety, tradition and novelty. Their histories add to our knowledge of Ottoman history as well as history of power structures. In the last chapter we will ponder the legacy of the Ottoman princes and palace women, their intertwined fates and legacy. The history of the Ottoman princes and the women of the palace is of power, ambition, sacrifice, and survival, a story that is sewn into the fabric of one of the greatest empires in history. At the end of this journey, we stop to consider their long-lasting influence, the legacies that they bequeathed, the lessons that they offer to life, and the manner in which they're intertwined. Destinies molded the Ottoman world, and far beyond. Princes and palace women. Passages from the Dar, by the Barber of Benares. From the first chapter to this one, we have witnessed how the fates and fictions of Ottoman princes and palace women were closely linked. Princes relied on their mothers and consorts for their lives, and for political backing. Women gained power via their connection to the Sultan, and by serving in the harem. The palace was a hothouse in which alliances were made, rivalries formed, and destinies decided. The stories behind these women's stories reveal a tangled mesh of people's emotions: love, jealousy, hope, fear, power, shaping the empire's political landscape. The never-ending games between rival princes and competing women made the political atmosphere quite interesting. It was the battle for succession that often led to instability in the empire. Complicity by the palace women and eunuchs left even more intrigue and complexity. They influenced policies, reforms, and diplomacy. This history of the empire is incomplete and impoverished if it denies the intimate and often concealed dynamics of power. Cultural and architectural legacies. The princes and palace women also left physical legacies. Beyond the realm of politics, their vision is carved in stone, in mosques, palaces, schools, those artifacts of ornate and formidable architecture. The arts also received royal patronage and helped enrich Ottoman culture. Religious gifts also were a major factor in the distribution of welfare throughout the empire today. These donations are still the object of admiration and study. Lessons from their lives. Their individual stories are lessons in leadership, resilience, and human complexity, power and compassion in a delicate balance. The price of ambition and competition. The power that lies in the most unlikely of places, beneath a veil and behind palace walls. How personal bonds shaped history. These stories are a reminder that history is made by individuals as much as by events. Modern perspectives and re-evaluations in palace life has radically been reinterpreted in recent scholarship as historically more than the sum of oppression and a controversial position to which Sultan adds another dimension, increasing recognition of the agency of women and eunuchs, acknowledgement of the harem as a political structure, recognizing the human side of life in the palace. Taking a second look on succession practices from a historical perspective. These are revelations that lend even greater complexity to our understanding of the empire. The long shadow of the Ottoman experience, the stories of Ottoman princes and palace women are still a source of fascination for historians, artists, and the public. Their tales are the subject of novels, movies, and scholarly studies. They are windows into a world that is at once alien and eerily relevant. A world in which power, sex, and politics entwined in ways that can still make them hard to pass out. Concluding thoughts. A tapestry of power and humanity. The glory of the Ottoman Empire resided not only in its conquered territories or monuments, but in the human stories behind the throne. Princes, mothers, wives, concubines, and eunuchs. None was exempt from the drama. Vast and intricate, their legacies also serve as a powerful reminder that history remains visceral, messy, profoundly human. Thank you for coming along on this journey through the lives and loves of Ottoman princes and the palace women. May their tales sow some seeds of curiosity, reflection, and deeper appreciation for the many faces of a rich, beautiful history.